This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What just happened did not arrive with sirens. There was no speech, no dramatic vote count scrolling across your screen, but something structural shifted quietly. A technical change, procedural, almost boring on paper. And yet, from this moment forward, the meaning of a right may depend less on what the Constitution says and more on where you are standing when you try to use it. Not tomorrow, not in theory. Now, this is how systems fail in advanced democracies. Not through collapse, through calibration, a small adjustment in how power is applied. Who can stop it? Who cannot? If you've ever assumed that certain rules were stable, that protections traveled with you, that assumption is no longer safe. Stay with me. Because once you see the mechanism underneath this change, you can't unsee what comes next. And if this feels abstract, good. That's how it always starts. For a long time, we were taught to look for control in the wrong place. We look at elections, at speeches, at personalities. But the system you're living inside is not primarily steered by who wins. It's steered by who can stop something from happening. For the past 2 decades, the real center of gravity wasn't Congress. It wasn't the White House. It was the pause button, a quiet power held by a very small number of people, the ability to freeze reality, to say, not yet, not anywhere. That power didn't feel dramatic. It felt procedural, temporary, responsible. But over time, it became structural. One legal decision could suspend enforcement everywhere, not because everyone was heard, but because someone somewhere asked first. That mechanism became the invisible regulator of the entire system. And most people never noticed it existed until it was suddenly pulled away. And when a system loses its stabilizer, it doesn't stop moving. It starts behaving very differently, which brings us to the shift that was already underway long before this moment. For years, this change happened so slowly, it felt like nothing was happening at all. Before, enforcement followed a simple assumption. If a rule was challenged, it paused everywhere, for everyone. That pause created a kind of artificial calm. Time to argue, time to adjust, time to pretend the system was still symmetrical. Now compare that to what's emerging. The pause no longer travels, it stays put. Protection becomes local, temporary, conditional. Before, the system moved like a single machine. Now it moves like fragments. One place advances, another freezes, another reverses, and because it doesn't happen all at once, it feels manageable. At first, this is the most dangerous kind of transformation. Not sudden, not explosive, normalized, each step justified as narrow, technical, reasonable, until the baseline shifts and what once felt unthinkable starts to feel administrative. You don't notice the loss immediately. You notice it when consistency disappears, when the same rule means different things in different places at the same time. And that's when the first shock arrives, not as a headline, but as a test case. The first shock doesn't announce itself as a crisis. It arrives as motion. A rule that was paused yesterday is enforced today, not after debate, not after warning, because the pause no longer applies where you are. One jurisdiction moves forward while another stays frozen. Not because the law changed, because the boundary did. Officials act not out of ideology, but permission. They were told they could, so they did. What makes this moment dangerous is not the policy itself. It's the speed. Within hours, strategies shift. Filings multiply. Enforcement calendars restart. Institutions that assumed uniformity suddenly discover they're operating blind. If you're watching closely, this is the moment when the system stops pretending it's synchronized. And if you're not watching closely, this is where it feels like nothing happened at all. Just normal operations resuming. If this matters to you, and it should, this is the point where paying attention stops being optional. because the next phase isn't about one rule coming back online. It's about what happens when every rule does at once. To understand what's actually happening, you have to stop thinking in terms of law and start thinking in terms of load. The system was never designed to handle the same fight everywhere at once. It relied on compression. One case, one pause. Nationwide effect. That compression absorbed pressure, political pressure, economic pressure, human pressure. Now that compression is gone, the conflict doesn't disappear. It multiplies. The same challenge must be filed again, and again, and again, each time in a different place, under different rules, with different timelines. Who benefits from that? Those with scale, those with capital, those who can afford redundancy. Who absorbs the damage? Everyone else. Costs spike, delays stretch, outcomes diverge. And while institutions scramble to adapt, enforcement doesn't wait. It moves where it's allowed to move. This is how a procedural change becomes an economic filter. Not by declaring winners, by exhausting challengers. And once exhaustion becomes policy, the next shock isn't a surprise. It's inevitable. Now the pace accelerates. There's no time for theory, no room for adjustment. Multiple rules come back online at once. In different places, on different days, compliance teams scramble, agencies issue guidance, then revise it, then pull it back. What's legal here is actionable there. What's blocked today moves tomorrow. No one has the full map. Election administrators wait for clarity that doesn't arrive. Hospitals ask which standard applies. Businesses hedge, then hedge again. Every decision carries risk now. Do nothing, you violate one rule. Act, you violate another. The system starts running hot. Appeals stack up. Lower courts hesitate. Deadlines don't. And because nothing has technically broken, there is no emergency brake, just motion. Faster. Uneven. This is the moment when uncertainty stops being a side effect and becomes the operating condition. And once uncertainty becomes normal, people stop planning. They start reacting, which is exactly where the human cost enters the frame. This is where it reaches you. Not as a theory, not as a case name, as friction. You discover that a protection you assumed existed no longer applies where you live, or where you work, or where your family crosses a line on a map. You don't get notified. There's no announcement. You find out when a process changes, when a form is denied, when a rule is enforced without warning. And when you ask why, the answer is simple. Because it's allowed here. The same action is blocked somewhere else. But that doesn't help you. This is what it feels like when rights become conditional, not revoked, localized. If this sounds abstract, pause for a moment. Think about how often your life depends on predictability. Now remove it. If this matters to you, don't disengage here. This is the point where attention is leverage, because what's happening to individuals now doesn't stay individual. It scales. And once it scales, it doesn't ask permission. Once the system fragments internally, the effects don't stay contained. They ripple outward. Other countries watch closely, not for the ruling itself, but for the signal. Uniform enforcement was the anchor. Predictability was the export. Now that anchor drags, cross-border agreements start to strain. Regulatory alignment weakens. Companies adjust supply chains not because laws changed, but because certainty did. Allies hesitate. Markets price in risk they can't localize. When one nation can no longer guarantee that its rules apply consistently across its own territory, it becomes harder to promise anything beyond it. And internally, pressure builds. States begin planning around each other, not with each other. Defensive policymaking replaces coordination. What was once federal becomes negotiable. What was once settled becomes provisional. This is no longer a legal debate. It's a systems problem, because systems that can't synchronize don't stabilize. They oscillate. And oscillation creates openings. The question now isn't whether this spreads, it's whether anyone still has the ability to slow it down. From here, the system doesn't choose a single future. It opens three. The first is adjustment. Institutions learn to operate inside fragmentation. More filings, more coordination, higher costs accepted as normal. Uniformity becomes an aspiration, not an assumption. The second path is erosion, not dramatic, incremental. Protections weaken not because they're overturned, but because they're uneven. Some people get them, some don't. And over time, that disparity stops feeling temporary. The third path is rupture. Too many conflicting rules, too many deadlines, too much uncertainty, a moment when enforcement collides with legitimacy, when compliance fails not out of defiance, but impossibility. None of these paths announce themselves in advance. They overlap, they accelerate each other. And crucially, none of them require bad faith to unfold. They only require a system that removed its own stabilizers without replacing them, which means the most dangerous question isn't which path we're on. It's whether the system can still recognize the difference. Because once it can't, the next decision won't feel like a choice. It will feel like momentum. Nothing about this ends cleanly. There is no moment where a single decision restores symmetry. No announcement that stability has returned. What exists instead is a new baseline. Quieter, more technical, harder to explain. A country where enforcement depends on location, where rights travel poorly, where uncertainty is not a bug, but a feature. You are not meant to panic here. You are meant to notice. Because systems like this don't collapse under pressure. They thin, they ask more from individuals, from institutions, from attention, and they fail only after people stop tracking the connections between cause and effect. If you want to understand what happens next, not as opinion, not as outrage, but as structure, this is the moment to keep following the chain. Not the headlines, the mechanics, because the most consequential changes rarely announce themselves as dangerous. They present as procedural. And by the time they feel personal, the system has already moved on. Stay with this. There's more underneath it, and the next shift won't be quieter.